What? How do I turn it on?
Vincent knows.
Vincent. Oh. Oh, sure.
My book on which cheers. Oh, you're gonna, oh, I forgot to do that. So, oh, it's right. Oh, sure. I mean, do you have questions?
Signature.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, I'm gonna see next.
Well, welcome everybody. I should have said that first before I crawled into the decision here. We want to welcome everybody in this storm. I mean, coming out just is amazing sadhana, right? On a night like this. But to see Swami Medhanananda, of course, is an honor, and we're very honored to have him here. These two, so far, it's just been really a blessing. Your first talk.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, it's been amazing. And it's on our YouTube channel, Las Vegas Vedanta Center, if you want to see it from last night and today too. So we'll try to put everything on there from now on, so you guys have access to everything. One thing I wanted to mention before we continue is that tomorrow it's changed. We're not going to the Hindu temple because of the weather situation, and they're gonna not have their canteen. So we're gonna do it here at 11 o'clock. So you're welcome to come here. So that's a slight modification. I sent out an email. There's also a YouTube channel. It's gonna be projected on YouTube, but it's gonna be the Las Vegas Hindu Temple's YouTube channel. We'll be showing us on this talk.
And originally it was 10 a.m. at the temple, but tomorrow it'll be 11 a.m. here, right?
Correct. So hopefully you can come or at least watch it on YouTube. So it's wonderful. So thank you so much. So we can maybe start with the chant. That's always, I guess, the way we start. So Om Satyam Satyamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mrityarma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So we thought we'd just do a couple chants real quickly. I think I'll go to 2 chants because we want to get Swami's talks very fast. So we'll do Hymn to Brahma, which is one of the pages you guys have. And it's always interesting with this one. You can sing it to your guru or your Ishta as an image of Brahma, the infinite consciousness. But you can also imagine or see yourself as that, and you can sing that from the first person. And somebody of realization would be singing that from their own state of consciousness. So we can pretend, sort of. Okay. And we'll do Ramakrishna Shala. Okay, great. Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Jhanati Prabhu, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Jhanati. Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Jhanati. Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Jhanati Prabhu Ram Krishna Charanam, Ram Krishna Charanam, Ram Krishna Charanam, Jhanati Prabhu Ram Krishna Charanam, Ram Krishna Charanam, Ram Krishna Charanam, Jhanati. Charana like to hum, charana like to hum, charana like to hum, Radhe. Charana like to hum, charana like to hum, charana like to hum, Radhe. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Radhe. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Namo. Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Namo. Jai Jai Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram. Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Arati. Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Kripahi Kevalam, Arati. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Arati. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Arati. Charana like to hum, charana like to hum, charana like to hum, Radhe. Charana like to hum, charana like to hum, charana like to hum, Radhe. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Prabhu Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Namo Shivurave, Namo Shivurave, Namo Shivurave, Namo Namo. Namo Shivurave, Namo Shivurave, Namo Shivurave, Namo Namo. Jai Jai Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Ram Krishna Charana, Jhanati. Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna 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 Ram Krishna Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Ram Krishna Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya So, there should be some music playing while I look at the stage change.
Do you need help?
No, we're good.
Do you want these back?
Huh?
Do you want these back?
Yeah, you can just leave them, or you can take them. It's okay. We meant to have many people at the Hindu temple, so they were made for that. So if you don't have them, you can feel to take them home. You got lots.
Hi everyone.
They are that.
Good to see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones. What's your name? Paulina. Hi, Paulina. And everyone else, I think it's in Vicky. Sorry, we met. I know everyone. Yeah, there you go. I know everyone else. That's nice.
She's new also.
No, well, we went hiking together this time. Yeah. Okay. Let me know when.
Yes, well, you can start when you want to. I'm
Yeah?
gonna adjust the camera.
Sorry, recording.
Yeah, I was good.
We got the whole thing going.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharmasvarupi avatara varishtaya Ramakrishna. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for making it out today in spite of the dreary weather predictions. So far, the worst is yet to come, I guess, right? Tomorrow morning is supposed to be when it's really bad. We'll see. So today, the title of this talk is somewhat provocative, and I hope interesting. And a lot of the words are in Sanskrit. Somebody told me that I understood 1 out of the 8 words. I hope to explain all 8 of the words, or however many words there are. So let me repeat the title first. Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Okay, so there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. First of all, that first main title, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. Does anyone know who said this? Or something very similar to this in the Bengali language. Hint. One of Sri Ramakrishna's direct disciples. No. At least as far as I'm aware, no. One more guess, and then I'll tell you. No. A good guess. No. Okay. Just now it's just random.
Now you're just going down the list.
Seeing what sticks. Turiyanandaji.
I've never done
His last words in Bengali were, I'll say the Bangla first and then I'll translate. Brahma Shatya, Jagat Shatya, Shab Shatya, Shatya Pran Pratishtito. Brahman is true, Brahman is real. Jagat Shatya, the world also is real. Shab Shatya, everything is real. Shatya Pran Pratishtito, all life itself is based on reality, on truth. These were his last words, very striking last words, highly philosophical and spiritual. And especially these first two short statements, Brahma Shatya Jagat Shatya, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. We won't be able to understand the philosophical and spiritual significance of these statements unless we know something about traditional Indian philosophy. For anyone who does have a little bit of background, when Swami Medhanandaji says Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, does this ring any bells? Can you hear any echoes of another great Indian philosopher? No? I'll give you one guess. Yes. Okay.
I do, but I don't know how to say the name.
Shankaraचार्य से आदि शंकराचार्य से जगत मिथ्या.
Exactly. Right? So anyone who knows anything about Indian philosophy will know something about Adi Shankaracharya, the great 8th century Indian philosopher who championed Advaita Vedanta. And his philosophy is captured in a very succinct Sanskrit formula. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. Very famous statement. It encapsulates in a nutshell the whole philosophy of Advaita Vedanta according to the school of Adi Shankaracharya, the great Shankaracharya. The formula is Brahma Satyam. Brahman alone is true. And what does he mean by Brahman? Non-dual pure consciousness. Impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness. Nirguna Brahma. Next phrase, in Shankara's formula. Jagat Mithya. The world is unreal from the ultimate standpoint. So Brahman alone is real. Everything else is unreal. Tables, books, glasses, pianos, all unreal. People. Only Brahman, pure consciousness, is true. Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. You, in your deepest essence, are identical with that non-dual Brahman. That's the whole of Advaita philosophy, according to Shankara. And as I said, this is the most well-known philosophy in India. And so when Turiyanji says, on his deathbed, right before he leaves his body, when he says Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, he's saying something very radical in an Indian philosophical context. Because he's putting Shankara on his head. He's turning him upside down. Brahma Satyam, he agrees with Shankara. Then he says Jagat Satyam. So then his own admirers, devotees, they became startled when they heard this. And there was conflict among them. What exactly did he mean by this? Wasn't he a great Advaitin himself? And now how is he suddenly saying the opposite of what Shankara said? It's very interesting. And so I begin with this. Why? Because the topic today is, how many of you have studied at least parts of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in any language? And many of you. So you're familiar with some of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, right? Sri Ramakrishna was a spiritual genius. He was also a philosophical genius, and I think his philosophical genius has been underestimated, even by his own devotees, in fact. And so part of the reason why I wrote this book, published in 2018, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, is to try to demonstrate that Sri Ramakrishna was not just a great mystic, yogi, realized soul, but also a great philosopher. And one of the problems, one of the difficulties in thinking of Sri Ramakrishna as a philosopher is that he didn't write books like ordinary philosophers like I do or other people do. Because everything he said was coming from his own spiritual experiences, of course. He didn't write anything. So the most comprehensive record of his teachings we have is contained in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Of course, ideally, if you can read the original language, that's best, because there are always distortions and inaccuracies in translations. The original Bangla is Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita by Mohendranath Gupta. And so to figure out what was Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, this is the task for today. It's a big topic, and we're only going to scratch the surface, but I wanted to kind of introduce you to some of the main important issues. But before we do so, you might ask, well, why all this high philosophy? Why not get straight to spiritual practice? That's for tomorrow. If you guys can make it up tomorrow. I've split up these two talks. Today is mainly about philosophy, but we'll see. I'll even talk about spiritual practice, the applications for spiritual practice at the end of today's talk, as a kind of segue into tomorrow's talk to make you want to come for more. Because tomorrow our talk will be the 4 yogas in spiritual life. So it's very, very much practically oriented. But we need to have a philosophical basis for our spiritual practice. That's why in Buddhism, does anyone know about the 4 noble truths in Buddhism? 4 noble truths. No? Sorry for the pop quiz here. So the first noble truth is everything is suffering. Okay, I'm not going to go through all 4. But the 4th noble truth is there's a way out of the suffering. And there's a way to attain nirvana, which is the ultimate state of spiritual fulfillment. What is that way, that path? Buddha calls it the Noble Eightfold Path. And the first step, if you want to call it step, some people call it factor, that might be better, because it's not necessarily sequential. But there's a reason why this is the first factor. What is the first factor? Samyak drishti, the right view, right understanding. It's on the basis of a right understanding of this world that we engage in our spiritual practices. If we don't have a fundamentally accurate understanding of what we're doing and who we are, what is this world, who is God, what is ultimate reality, no matter how much spiritual practice we do, we don't know if we're going in the right direction. We don't know what our goal is. We don't know what it is we're meditating on. What is the nature of whether it's God or whether it's Brahman. So that's the importance of philosophy. It's not that only some philosophers should be interested in philosophy. Every spiritual aspirant must have some basic understanding of the philosophical framework within which they are engaging in spiritual practice. So if we're a follower of Krishna, we better have some rudimentary understanding of Vaishnava philosophy. And if we're followers of Sri Ramakrishna, we better have some understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. That's the idea behind today's talk. What exactly is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And it seems to me that Turianji has given an extremely profound and comprehensive answer to this question, captured in that very succinct formula, said on his deathbed, which has a special significance. Especially, not only was he a realized soul, direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he was a great scholar also, and he thought deeply about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And in fact, he was asked by another monk, Sarvanandaji, what exactly is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And this other monk, Sarvanandaji, he himself was very learned, and he had especially carefully studied Shankara's philosophy. And so whenever he's reading Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, he's always comparing them against Shankara's teachings, and he finds, wait a minute, but sometimes they don't seem to match. And he keeps getting kind of puzzled. Especially one thing he really gets stuck on. Shankara said, Jagat Mithya, the world is unreal, this world of names and forms. Stereo, unreal. Book, unreal. Table, unreal. Glass of coconut milk, unreal. Coconut water, unreal. Right? And then when you open the gospel, almost every page, Sri Ramakrishna is saying this world is real because the world is nothing but God. Everything in this world is suffused with divine consciousness. And he gives an example from his own spiritual experience. He says, one day I was doing puja, like I was just doing briefly. And he says, and I found that, Bangla, he said, Kosha Kushi Brahma. So the puja vessels are Brahman. I saw it as nothing but divine mother, divine consciousness. I saw it at the door sill, divine consciousness. Cat walked into the room, divine consciousness. Myself, divine consciousness. I saw nothing but divine consciousness. And so Sarvanandaji specifically mentions this incident. And he says, Sri Ramakrishna is saying the puja vessels themselves, they're divine consciousness. Shankara's view is that when you subtract names and forms from this world, what's left is Brahman. If you remove the chairness of this chair, what's left is Brahman. If you remove the tableness of this table, what's left is Brahman. If you remove the bookness from this book, what's left is Brahman. If you remove the Medhananda of the Medhananda, what's left is the same Brahman. But Sri Ramakrishna seems to be saying something quite different. This name and form as a book itself is a real manifestation of divine consciousness. This table as a table is a real manifestation of the same divine consciousness. So it's not that you subtract names and forms and what's left is Brahman, but the names and forms themselves are divine consciousness. And so he writes a letter to Turiyanji, disturbed. As a philosopher, he's troubled by this. He says, how can this be? How can Sri Ramakrishna be contradicting the great Shankara? And Turiyanji writes a very profound 2-page letter, written originally in Bengali in response to this, explaining what he takes to be Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. And I'm not going to, it would be a different class. I've given a class on this several times, analyzing this letter line by line. And you can find it online if you're interested. But I just want to highlight a couple points that he raises in this letter. Number one, he says that what Sri Ramakrishna taught is that the ultimate reality is Advaita. Advaita is non-dualism, non-duality. And then you might think, well, then he seems to be agreeing with Shankara. But no, Turiyanji immediately goes on to explain what he means by Advaita. The ultimate reality is Advaita in the sense that it is, on the one hand, Bhagavan, the personal God, Shakti. And on the other hand, attributeless, non-dual, pure consciousness, Brahman, what is called Brahman by Shankara. But it's equally both. So I'm going to anticipate a little bit, jump ahead a little bit. We're going to get to this in more detail later. But he's thinking very directly, very clearly about one of Sri Ramakrishna's own teachings. One of Sri Ramakrishna's most frequent teachings found in the Gospel, Brahma Shakti Abhed. Non-dual Brahman and the personal Shakti, the dynamic Shakti, are inseparable. They're the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of one and the same infinite divine reality. Okay? And then he says, what about this issue of this question you're raising about how can the puja vessels themselves be divine consciousness? That doesn't make sense to me, says Shravananda. He says, why shouldn't the puja vessels be divine consciousness? And Turiyanji gives the example of an ocean. He says, imagine, you don't have to imagine, we see it. When you visit a beach, you see this. Ocean forms into waves. And he says that these waves, does it make sense to say that just because the wave is temporary, that it's unreal, it never existed? No. The wave was perfectly real while it existed, even though it was nothing but the ocean. And he says in the same way, every single name and form that we see is nothing but Brahman in different real manifestations. In a manifestation as a book, as a table, as a glass, as a piano. But you shouldn't dismiss these names and forms as unreal. Everything is Brahman, and the forms themselves are different manifestations of Brahman. So that's a little background, a little prelude. So now let's come back to this big whopper of a question. What is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And I discussed this in great detail in chapter 1 of this book. And what I'll be doing today is summarizing some of the main arguments that I make in that book. The first thing I do, though, is I mention that this is a very controversial question. And different readers of the gospel, different devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, different monks in our order have answered this question in different ways, which is quite interesting. And many people don't even know about it, know that there are different possible answers to this question. What are some of the possible answers? I'll give you an example. And I'll mention that it seems to me that there are 3 main approaches to answering this question. What is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? The first approach is what I call the sectarian approach. And I don't mean that in any negative sense. I just mean that they argue that Sri Ramakrishna belonged to a particular philosophical sect. In Sanskrit, the term is sampradaya. Who are some of these people? You might be surprised to know, especially those of you who can't read Bengali, who are relying on the English translation of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, translated by Swami Medhanandaji. M himself, the author of the Gospel, Mahendranath Gupta. There's a passage which is completely omitted in the English translation, where M quite surprisingly says, Thakur was not a follower of Shankara. He was a follower of Ramanuja. He was a Vishishtadvaita, a qualified non-dualist. Why? And M says, because he used the example of a bale fruit. It's a special kind of fruit, which you don't really find here in the US, unless you pay big bucks maybe. And he says to take the whole weight of the bale fruit, you have to include the seeds and shell. You can't just take the pulp and the flesh inside. You need the whole weight. He says, likewise, it can't just be that Brahman alone is real and that everything else is unreal. No! All the different jivas, meaning individual souls, all the different souls sitting in this room right now, all the inanimate objects in this world, the pianos, the books, the tables, everything, we have to include everything in this Advaitic totality. Everything is God. And M felt that because he used this metaphor and because in many places he said this world is not unreal. That's not my view. My view is that this whole world is nothing but divine consciousness. M thought he's a follower of Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta. So M was one person who claimed that he was a follower of one particular philosophical school. But there are many others who disagree with him. Several of our monks, Omkaranandaji, Dhiryanandaji, say that we agree that he was a follower of a particular philosopher, but we don't agree with you that was Ramanuja. We believe that he was a follower of Shankara. He was a follower of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And they give other evidence for this. They say that, well, because Sri Ramakrishna practiced Advaita under who? Who is his guru who taught him Advaita? Totapuri, the great wandering naked monk who taught him Advaita. And he attained the highest within a startlingly short period of time, three days. He attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he attained Brahman. And how did he attain Brahman? By sawing somebody in half. Whom did he saw in half to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi? His own beloved Kali. Wow. And so Advaita counts on this and this. He had to cut in half his own beloved personal God to arrive at the highest truth, which is Nirguna Brahman, which supports Shankara's philosophy. So these debates have been going on. So that's just the first camp. And there are others. There's actually a Western scholar named Walter Neville. In 1976, he published an important article called, I think, The Philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna. He claims that Sri Ramakrishna was a Tantrika. He was a follower of Tantra. His first guru was a woman, many of you probably know this, Bhairavi Brahmani, who was a Vaishnava Tantric, who taught him all about Tantra and had him undergo various Tantric practices. And many of his teachings can only be understood from the standpoint of Tantra, according to a number of scholars like Walter Neville. What's an example? He gives the example of the teaching I just gave you. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. He says, no way can Shankara explain this, because he's affirming the reality of both Brahman and Shakti. And only Tantra does that. Shankara doesn't, because he denies the ultimate reality of Shakti, of the personal God. Okay, so that's the first camp. Sectarian interpretations of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Second approach. This is what I call the no philosophy approach. Two scholars I can think of who adopt this are Aumyo Shen, based in Delhi in India, and Narasingha Sil, a scholar based in Oregon, I think, here in the US. Both of them say, wait a minute, you're barking up the wrong tree. Because Sri Ramakrishna left school at about the age of 6. He's not educated. He didn't write any books. So why the heck are we trying to extrapolate any kind of philosophy on the basis of his teachings? Let him be him. He was a simple bhakta and mystic. Of course, he realized God. But why turn him into a philosopher? And why try to force all of his teachings into any kind of coherent philosophical framework? Part of his beauty is that he was just throwing off these beautiful philosophical gems, but not necessarily in any coherent system. Second approach. Third approach is what I call the non-sectarian approach to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, philosophical teachings. And I would place, first of all, where would you place Turiyanandaji? Turiyanandaji says, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. Sri Ramakrishna taught that the ultimate reality is Advaita. I haven't explained his view in enough detail to really help you answer the question. But I would put Turiyanandaji in this third camp, in this non-sectarian camp. I would put Swami Medhanandaji himself in this non-sectarian camp. And I, myself, in my own work, have tried to defend this third non-sectarian approach to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. What do I mean by non-sectarian? Let's first of all identify what are the problems. Why am I not going with either the first sectarian approach or the second no philosophy approach? The problem with the first approach, the sectarian approach, I think, is that it's inevitably Procrustean. Does anyone know what the word Procrustean means? No? Procrustes, this is from ancient mythology, Western mythology, was a guy who did something very bad. And so his punishment is a very terrible kind of punishment. He was a giant. he was forced to lie on a slab, like a stone slab, which wasn't big enough for his whole body. And so his legs were kind of dangling off the slabs, parts of his arms were hanging off, even his head was kind of. And then they take a chainsaw or something, the equivalent of a chainsaw back then. I don't think they had electricity. And they would cut around the slab. So whatever's hanging off the slab would be, and it's a kind of constant torture and agony. Can never die. So now there's an expression in English, a Procrustean bed. That slab, right? That bed. Putting somebody on a Procrustean bed means you're not honoring, you're not accepting the whole comprehensive totality. You're ignoring or dismissing or somehow undervaluing certain aspects of whatever you're discussing. So it seems to me that the first approach, the sectarian approach, any attempt to claim that Sri Ramakrishna was just a follower of Shankara, or just a follower of Ramanuja, or just a follower of Vaishnavism, or just a follower of Tantra. Of course he was a follower of them to a certain extent. He accepted some of their teachings, he accepted the spiritual experiences on which these great philosophies were based. But the moment you say that his whole philosophy can be explained in terms of Shankara's framework, or Ramanuja's framework, you're forcing Sri Ramakrishna onto a Procrustean bed. You're not able to take into account the whole totality of his teachings. So that seems to be the problem with the first approach. Second approach, the no philosophy approach. I think the problem with this approach is that it's a little silly to say that just because somebody didn't get a PhD formally, of course there's no such thing as at that time in the 19th century, PhD wasn't a thing. Masters was a thing. M, the author of the gospel, had I think 2 or 3 master's degrees. But having a PhD was not even a thing. And even so, if you've realized God and you're speaking from on the basis of your spiritual experience, why do you don't need to have all those fancy credentials to count as a philosopher, it seems to me. The proof is in the pudding. Look at the teachings and see whether you can discern a kind of coherent philosophy on the basis of his teachings. And I think that they're too quick to dismiss the possibility that Sri Ramakrishna really was a serious philosophical thinker. So, the third approach, this non-sectarian approach, the essence of this approach is, instead of trying to pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna into any of the existing philosophies, let's try to understand his philosophy as a very, very broad, very liberal philosophy that harmonizes the existing philosophical schools, that harmonizes and reconciles the different existing world religions, right? And the moment you pigeonhole him, you're not able to explain how he harmonizes, because you have to be broader than the things you're harmonizing, right? And if you're just a Shankarite, you're not going to be able to harmonize the non-Shankara schools. If you just follow Ramanuja, you're not going to be able to, right? So his philosophy has to be explained in a very broad way in order to explain how he can accept Shankara's philosophy while also accepting Ramanuja's, while also accepting Tantra, also accepting Christianity and Islam and Buddhism. How does he do it? Because his own philosophy is so broad and is deeply harmonizing at its basis. Okay. So now, let me try to explain some of the core doctrines of Sri Ramakrishna's non-sectarian philosophy. And the name I give his philosophy is Vijnana Vedanta. So I'm beginning to explain some of the words in this mysterious cryptic title of today's talk. So Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, I hope you already understand. Okay. The subtitle was Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. That's the name I've given to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Why? There are 2 words. One is Vijnana, the other is Vedanta. Vedanta also is a kind of tricky word to understand. Even all of us, in a certain sense, we're familiar with the term, right? Because all of our centers are usually called Vedanta centers, Vedanta societies, right? And I often ask, I did this actually a couple of weeks ago in the class. I asked the students who are sitting here, the devotees, I said, you come regularly to our Vedanta societies. What if a friend were to ask you, where'd you go this morning? And you said, well, I went to the Vedanta society. And they never heard of the word Vedanta. And they might ask you, well, what is Vedanta exactly? How would you respond to that question? And there are about 10 people in the room. I got 10 different answers. That's the beauty of Vedanta in a way, right? But just as a very kind of crash course in Vedanta, it seems to me that we can say that there are 3 basic meanings of the word Vedanta. Most fundamentally, Vedanta means the Upanishads. because Vedanta itself is comprised of two words combined in one word. Veda plus Anta. Veda means the Vedas, the great scriptures, the ancient scriptures. Anta means end, literally, but it can also mean culmination. And so Vedanta literally means the culminating portion of the Vedas, aka the Upanishads themselves. The part of the Vedas that contain the highest spiritual teachings in the Vedas. So in the original sense, Vedanta means the Upanishads. Okay? Second meaning of Vedanta is a little broader than this, because it includes Upanishads, but they say that there are two other scriptures that we also have to include under the rubric of Vedanta. What are them? Or what are they? Very good, exactly. It's what's called in Sanskrit the Prasthana Traya, the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta. The three pillars on which Vedanta stands. What are the three pillars? Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. Okay? But there's yet another meaning of the term Vedanta. Many different schools of Vedanta, philosophical schools of Vedanta, developed over the centuries. Each of them claiming to give the most accurate, truest interpretation of the same Upanishads and the same Gita. Shankara wrote brilliant commentaries on these texts, on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, and saying all these scriptures support my philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, and not any other philosophy. Ramanuja comes along and says, you're totally wrong. Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra all support my philosophy, which is Vishtadvaita Vedanta, and these debates have been going on for centuries. Okay, and so each one of these schools of Vedanta, whether it's Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, Ramanuja's school of Vishtadvaita Vedanta, and there are many others, Madhva's school of dualistic Vedanta, Chaitanya's school of Achintya Bheda Vedanta, all of them claim that they are the true Vedanta. And one common tendency, which you find even today, is when people use the word Vedanta, they usually are thinking of one particular philosophical school of Vedanta. Namely, which one? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he knows. Yeah. Shankara is Advaita Vedanta. But they don't say Advaita Vedanta, they just say Vedanta. This was a common practice in Sri Ramakrishna's time. It's still a common practice even now. But it's misleading and it's really inaccurate. Swami Vivekananda himself said it's inaccurate to say that, to equate Vedanta with Shankara's school, because Ramanuja, Madhva, all of them have an equal right to be called Vedantas. Okay, so keep in mind how broad this term is. So now coming back to the subtitle of today's talk, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. What do I mean by Vedanta when I say that? What I mean is what Sri Ramakrishna did on the basis of his own spiritual experiences. He never taught, he was not bookish in that sense. He was not an intellectual. But he had a deep knowledge of scripture. How? Number one, because many pundits would come to visit him. And he listened very carefully, and he was a Shrutidhar, so he could remember anything he heard and recite it back. He heard the Gita, he heard Bhagavad Purana, he heard the Upanishads, right? And so he's exposed to different scriptures. And of course, he realized God in so many different forms and aspects. And so he had a very deep understanding of the original meaning of the scriptures on the basis of his own spiritual experiences, which is the best way to understand the scriptures. It's better to have a deep spiritual knowledge of the scriptures, because these scriptures are based on spiritual knowledge, not on just intellectual knowledge, right? And so you'll find him sometimes in the gospel, after explaining these very lofty philosophical teachings, spiritual teachings, he'll say, like, Brahman has become everything, the 24 cosmic principles. Then he says, haven't you read the Gita? Haven't you read the Adhyatma Ramayana? You'll find that teaching in there. You see how he's, so that's why, this is a short answer to the question of why I call this philosophy Vijnana Vedanta. Because this is something that Swami Vivekananda emphasized again and again. He said, if you really want to understand what the Upanishads teach, Bhagavad Gita teaches, Brahma Sutras teach, don't rely on any of these traditional commentators, like Shankara or Ramanuja. Why? Does anyone know why he said not? He said, don't blindly follow any of these commentators. Why do you think that is? Any guesses?
Find the truth yourself.
That's true. I mean, yeah, so be a critical thinker, find the truth yourself. That's one part of the answer. The other thing is he said that the main aim of all of these traditional commentators, even though they were realized souls and they were geniuses, their main aim was to establish their particular philosophical school. What happens because of that as a result? They ended up having to torture. He used pretty strong language at certain points. He said they had to torture certain the passages from these scriptures, the Upanishads, Gita, which didn't agree with their philosophy. And somehow, by hook or by crook, in Gita, Shankara is really hard pressed in certain places because Gita is praising bhakti left and right. Bhakti means devotion toward the personal God. And that doesn't have a very high status in Shankara's philosophy. It's a lower stage, it's a preparatory discipline for those who don't have sufficiently pure and concentrated minds. And so he has to bend over backwards and engage in Olympic level gymnastics to try to prove that the Gita is supporting his philosophy. So this is what I think Swami Vivekananda had in mind. So he said, instead of relying on any of these traditional commentators, we can gain a much deeper and better understanding of the original meaning of these great scriptures, Vedantic scriptures, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutra, if we read them in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. He said this again and again. We haven't really, even as followers in our tradition, as monks, we haven't really tried to carry out the project that Swami Vivekananda had envisioned, to be honest. Often we teach the scriptures using Shankara, but I don't think that's what Swami Vivekananda wanted. So I'm trying in my own humble way, in a small way too. I just started teaching a course at Hollywood called Bhagavad Gita and the Life of Sri Ramakrishna. And this is the reason. Okay, so that's the Vedanta part of the subtitle. We're finally getting to the final mysterious Sanskrit word, Vijnana. Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Vijnana. Some of you raised your hand when I asked, have you read the gospel? Does the word Vijnana ring any bells? Yeah.
Yeah, Vijnana is there. Gyan and Vijnana is two things.
Two things. What are they? What do you mean by things?
One of the Jnana we all know, other one of the Vijnana is beyond actually.
Very good.
realization, yeah.
Good. We all know Jnana. We're all Jnanis already. So no problem. Why are we sitting here? Let's go.
Vijnana is beyond Jnana. In other words, when you're, like I read in Thakur's divine play, his Bhava Samadhi, that's when he really talks about
Yeah. Not really Bhava Samadhi, Bhava Mukha.
Yeah, Bhava
Bhava
Mukha.
Mukha.
Sorry.
Not exactly the same thing.
No, but I
Very
missed
Yeah. No, very good. You've studied the art literature carefully. Good. So the first core teaching of Sri Ramakrishna is this. I'll just expand on what you said. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, there are two very lofty stages in spiritual experience, which he referred to as jnana and vijnana. And he used a beautiful metaphor to explain this. He says, imagine that you're climbing up a staircase to reach the roof. He likens climbing up the staircase to the classical Advaitic process of jnana yoga, discrimination, saying not this, neti, neti. Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not these individual souls, Brahman is not the personal God. The world's unreal. As you leave the steps behind one by one. Ultimately, what happens? You reach the roof. What does the roof signify? Knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. Brahma Jnana. In the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Okay? That's Jnana. He says, Sri Ramakrishna would say, when you attain the state of Jnana, and if you come back from the state of Samadhi, you look up, the Jnani looks upon this world as a framework of illusion. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. This is the essence of Shankara's philosophy, right? Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But remember Turiyanji's last words. Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. What's the basis of that teaching? Because Sri Ramakrishna's teaching doesn't end there. He says, some people, after reaching the roof, realize that the stairs are made of the same materials as the roof. Bricks, lime, and brick dust. The Vijnani is the one who, after reaching the roof, can come back down the stairs and go up the stairs at will. The roof represents what he calls the Nitya, the eternal, non-dual Brahman. The stairs represent God's manifestation, what he calls the Leela, God's divine play as this entire manifestation, which is real. And the Vijnani sees God everywhere and in every state. Not just in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi by being one with non-dual pure consciousness, but he can descend the staircase and he realizes, what does the Vijnani realize according to Sri Ramakrishna? Two things. Number one, he says in Bangla, Vijnani dekhe jini nirgun tini shogun. The Vijnani realizes that divine reality which is nirguna is also saguna. What do these terms mean? Nirguna means non-dual pure consciousness, attributeless Brahman of Shankara. But that divine reality is also Saguna Brahman, otherwise known as Shakti, the personal God. What do I mean by the personal God? The loving God to whom we pray, who creates, preserves, and destroys this world, who responds to our prayers, who is omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, right? This is the personal God. What are examples? Kali, Krishna, Ramakrishna, Christ, Allah. These are all examples of the personal God. Sri Ramakrishna says it's the Vijnani who, after realizing that in his deepest essence he is nothing, he or she is nothing but non-dual pure consciousness, that same Brahman is one with Shakti. So he would say, যখন তিনি নিষ্ক্রিয় তখন আমি ব্রহ্ম বলে কই, যখন তিনি সৃষ্টি প্রলয় করছেন তখন আমি শক্তি বলে কই. When that reality, when I think of that reality as niskriya, inactive, then I call it Brahman. When I think of that same divine reality as creating, preserving, and destroying this universe, then I call it Shakti or Kali. Give the example of a snake. When a snake is stationary, that's like non-dual Brahman, static Brahman. When that same snake is moving, wriggling across the ground, that's Shakti. It's the same Brahman, but in its dynamic aspect. Both equally real, just in different states, you can say, different aspects. So number one, he says that the Vijnani goes beyond Jnana. The Vijnani also reaches the roof. After reaching the roof, can come up and down the staircase, realizing that the same reality is equally Brahman and Shakti. Secondly, that same ultimate reality, Brahman, has become the 24 cosmic principles. Which means, he says, that instead of seeing this world as a framework of illusion, as mithya, the Vijnani sees this world as satya. How can the world be unreal if I see nothing but God? I literally see the book as God, I see the table as God, I see the cat as God, I see all of you as God. I don't, but Trump did. Still working on it. Right? If you see everything as God, how can it be unreal? Sri used to say, do I only see God with my eyes closed? What happens when I open my eyes? God disappears? No! I see God equally with my eyes open. I see God in all of you, in everything I see. But that means this world is real as God. Right? So his teachings on these two fundamental stages in spiritual realization, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana, are absolutely fundamental to understanding his overall philosophy. Okay? So that's the first key tenet. And you might ask, well, which was he, a Jnani or a Vijnani? He says it very clearly. He says, the Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a Vijnani, not the state of a Jnani. Does that mean he was not a Jnani? Of course he was a Jnani. Remember that Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Jnana pore Vijnana. After Jnana comes Vijnana. You can't be a Vijnani unless you've already passed through Jnana. It's a greater state. It's a more comprehensive state. How do we know greater? Sri Ramakrishna himself would sometimes, he would say, remember, the Jnani is no small fry. I mean, this person has realized Brahman, for goodness sakes, right? So what he would say, the Jnani is like a flimsy piece of driftwood floating on a river. What happens when a crow sits on it? It sinks because it's so flimsy. He says the Vijnani is like a giant blob. It can carry many creatures across with it, and it won't sink. It'll happily carry all these creatures across the river to the other shore. What does that river represent? The ocean of samsara, the river of samsara. It can take you to the other shore of suffering and woe. It can give. The Vijnani is the person who comes back to this world out of love and compassion for us poor suffering souls, and tries to bring us to the highest state of spiritual illumination. That, he says, is the speciality of the Vijnani. It should remind us of the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of very good, the Bodhisattva, exactly. Because Mahayana Buddhism, as opposed to Theravada Buddhism, at least according to Mahayana, of course, they'll say that, well, Theravada is great, the goal of nirvana, wonderful. But the problem with it is there's a kind of higher form of selfishness in that, because they only care about attaining nirvana for themselves, ultimately. We believe in the ideal of foregoing our own nirvana. We want to come back in order to help others to attain nirvana. Let everybody attain nirvana together. That's the Bodhisattva idea. Let me help others, and then I'll also get my Nibbana. So the Vijnani is like that. The Vijnani is so full of spiritual compassion that he comes back to help others who are struggling in this world. Okay? So that's the first key tenet of Vijnana Vedanta. And this is why I call it Vijnana Vedanta. Because now the gospel itself is full of philosophical teachings. But one of the things that's difficult about trying to discern a philosophy on the basis of the gospel is that it wasn't written as a textbook, right? Sri Ramakrishna didn't write anything in that way. So what we have are scattered teachings. And not just that, in the form of dialogues with various visitors, coming from all walks of life and of varying persuasions. Followers of Vaishnavism came to him, Advaita Vedantins came to him, Tantrics came to him, followers of the Brahma Samaj, which was this really happening Hindu reform movement in the 19th century, which is now almost defunct. Lots of people came, Christians came to him, some Muslims came to him. You think he's going to be giving the same teachings to all of them? No, he taught on the basis of who they were, right? So you also have to take into account context. With whom is he speaking, right? And so now in order to understand what his philosophy is, you also have to take into account this context. In many places in the gospel, you'll find him saying things like, Jnanis believe this, but I believe this. So one example, he says in the gospel, he says, Jnanis, followers of Shankara, they dismiss all three states. What are those three states? Anyone who's studied some of Shankara's philosophy or watched some of Sarvapriyan's lectures should be able to answer this. What are the three states that followers of Shankara dismiss as ultimately unreal? Very good. We know she's a good student of Shankara and possibly of Sarvapriyan. Or maybe just of Sarvapriyan. Good. Very good. Waking, dream, and deep sleep. Jnanis say that none of these states are real ultimately. The only truth is Turiya, the fourth, beyond all three of these states. What is the fourth? Brahman, which is our true nature, right? So Sri Ramakrishna says that. Exactly like that. He says Jnanis dismiss all three states as unreal. They only accept Brahman, the Turiya state, the fourth. I, however, he goes on to say, I, however, accept all states. I accept the reality of all the states. Because he's a Vijnani. So he says, yes, the waking state itself is a real manifestation of God. The dream state, also a real manifestation of God. Deep sleep, yes, same manifestation, but just on different planes of consciousness, we're communing with the same God in different ways. And what often happens when people discuss Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is they take his teachings out of context. I remember having fun debates with a very old friend of mine, a very senior Swami named Kalipada Maharaj, who left his body a few years ago. I would visit him frequently in a kind of nursing home we have for elderly sadhus in Beluma, the global headquarters of the Ramakrishna Order. I visit him. He's a staunch follower of Shankara, and he would say, you're wrong in teaching this Vijnana Vedanta stuff. Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Shankara. I said, prove it, Maharaj. And he said, because Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Shakti is also unreal. Jnanis also dismiss all three states. I said, yes, he does say that, but what's the context? He goes on to say, but I, however, accept all the states. And I don't dismiss Shakti as unreal. I said, so you can't just cherry pick those statements. So, but we were very good friends, and we had these friendly debates. And so it's very important when trying to understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings not to take his teachings out of context. Look at the whole paragraph or whatever. With whom is he speaking? What's his view? He often talks about other people's views, but where does he stand with respect to the Vaishnavas, with respect to the Advaitins, right? Okay, so keep that in mind. So, coming back to, now the second main tenet is, what is the nature of ultimate reality? What does Sri Ramakrishna say? On the basis of his spiritual state of Vijnana, as opposed to just Jnana, he says, the ultimate reality is, in one aspect, impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, the Brahman of Advaita Vedanta. It's equally Shakti, the personal God, which can manifest in infinite forms. As Kali, Krishna, Christ, you name it. And there's so many. There's a huge pantheon of Hindu gods, for instance. All of them are different forms of the same personal God, infinite personal God, which is one with Brahman. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, he used to teach. Brahma Shakti Abhed. What were his analogies to explain the inseparability of Brahman and Shakti? Anybody who's read the gospel carefully? What was his favorite, at least some of his favorite analogies, to explain how Brahman and Shakti are inseparable? Anyone know? Anyone want to take a stab?
It's like fire and it's
He's very shy, but see when he spits fire.
I knew he was gonna
So
come out
that's-
somehow, right?
exactly. Very good, Vincent. I'm impressed. Yeah, exactly. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like fire and its power to burn. Now, what's the significance, the philosophical significance of this analogy? Think about this analogy. He himself explains it. He says, one cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn. One cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. Likewise, one cannot think of Brahman without thinking of Shakti. One cannot think of Shakti without thinking of Brahman. The two concepts, the two ideas, the two aspects of reality mutually entail one another. You can't have one without the other. You can't think of one without the other. Now, let's go back briefly to Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. What was his favorite analogy? Since you're an expert in Advaita Vedanta, maybe you can tell us. What was Shankara's favorite analogy to explain this world appearance? Anyone? Maya, no, but an analogy, like using, just like Sri Ramakrishna will say fire and its power to burn.
Clay in the pot.
Snake.
Is there snake?
Ah, the snake.
Rope and snake.
You're very good. Rajju Sarpa. Shankara loved ropes and snakes. His favorite animal is the snake, and his favorite entity, yeah, the rope. I love those things. So he uses it all the time. You'll find it all over the place in his commentaries on the scriptures.
Another is light post and the man. No, ghost. That's the same thing.
Okay, but yeah, but the one they used very frequently was this rope and snake. Okay, but let's just dwell on this for a second. So let's compare these two analogies. Okay, Sri Ramakrishna is using, he's saying Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like fire and its power to burn. That's his analogy. Shankara is saying Brahman is the ultimate truth. Everything else is mithya, it's unreal. What's that like? It's like when there's a rope, but instead of seeing the rope as a rope, you see it as a snake. Let's say that the rope is kind of far away, and my vision's not great. I look at it, I get frightened. Why? Because I think it's a snake. But then I wait, is it a dead snake? Because it's not moving. Then we get closer. Then I realized, oh, it was a rope all along. Was there ever a snake?
No.
No.
No. There was a rope all along. It was my stupidity, my ignorance of the rope, which made me think it was a snake. I misperceived the rope as a snake. Right? Now, think. Now I need you guys to think about this. Does the rope depend for its existence on the snake? In Shankara's analogy. No. You can have the rope without, because the snake never existed. That was just an illusion in our own minds. The rope is a rope, whether or not we hallucinate a snake on it, or any of it, you can see it as anything else, right? Does the snake depend for its existence on the rope?
No.
Why? Not a real snake. I mean this snake. Like
Yes, yes.
Oh.
that rope that I perceive as a snake,
Yeah.
is that hallucinated snake? Does it depend on the rope for its existence?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Because the rope is the truth.
Yeah, because the rope is a substratum of my misperception. I can't hallucinate a snake unless I can't if I'm on LSD or something. But what I mean is, when I see a rope as a snake, the substratum, the reality behind my hallucination is the rope. If there was no rope, I wouldn't have hallucinated a snake there where the rope was. Do you see what I mean? So there's an asymmetry in the relationship between the rope and the snake. The rope does not depend on its existence on the snake, but the snake does depend for its existence on the rope. By contrast, Sri Ramakrishna's analogy is bidirectional. Shakti depends for its existence on Brahman, that Shankara would agree with, but not the opposite of that. Which is that, but Brahman also depends for its existence on Shakti, because the two are inseparable. You can't cut off my arm and my legs and say that I'm the same person, because you have to take the thing as a whole. And divine reality, according to Sri Ramakrishna, is both Brahman and Shakti. You can't have one without the other. So here again, we see that there's an important difference. Even you can see how there's so much depth and profundity and philosophical significance, even in many of Sri Ramakrishna's analogies, metaphors, parables, stories. The Gospel's full of these things. And there's a kind of deceptive simplicity in his teachings, because there's something so simple that we read them, we love. He was like Jesus in that way. He taught using parables and stuff. But there's profound, almost infinite depth behind each one of his teachings. In fact, Swami Medhanandaji used to say. One can write shelves of philosophical books based on any one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. There's that much depth to his teachings. I've just been unpacking one of his teachings for so long, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. Okay, so coming back to the second tenet of Vijnana Vedanta. Sri Ramakrishna will say the ultimate reality is not just Brahman but also Shakti, right? Not just impersonal but also personal, not just Nirguna but also Saguna, not just Nirakara but also Sakara. These are some new terms I'm introducing. These are Sanskrit and Bengali terms. Nirakara means formless. Sakara means with form. It says that divine reality is formless, certainly. Islam believes in formless but personal God. Otherwise personal, but without form. They don't believe in avatars, incarnations. They don't believe in the forms of God like Krishna and Gandhi and all that. But they believe that God is personal because they pray. You know what the meaning of the term Islam is? We talked about this yesterday. It means surrender. Yeah, Sharanagati. It means surrender to God. Islam, it means literally surrendering to God. So they believe in a personal God which is formless. Some people think, how can personal God be formless? We can't be formless, at least not now. We will be when we leave the body. And then because we'll only realize that once we leave the body. And then we take on a new one. That proves that we're also formless in a certain sense. But the personal God can be formless. But the personal God, according to Sri Ramakrishna, can equally manifest in various forms. And all the forms of God are real. What was an example he used? This is one of my favorite analogies. It's wonderful. He says, imagine an infinite ocean. That's the ocean of Satchitananda, divine consciousness. He says, under the cooling influence of the breeze, the gentle breeze of bhakti, devotion, what happens? That ocean forms into ice at different places in the ocean. What are those forms of ice? Different forms of the personal God. Then the story continues. But with the rising of the sun of knowledge, Gyan Shuja, what happens? The forms of ice melt. The same infinite expansive ocean. Followers of Shankara will feel vindicated at this point. And say exactly, that's what I've been saying all along. You have to cut Kali. You have to cut Kali in half. You have to saw her in half to reach the highest truth, which is Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna is supporting our philosophy. Sri Ramakrishna says, I was going to say, hold my beer. He didn't drink. Then he said, no, let me continue the analogy. It doesn't stop there. He says, but in some places, the ice doesn't melt at all. In some places, the ice doesn't melt at all. It becomes quartz. Shkotikar, Nittoshakar. It remains as eternal forms of the personal God. Even the Son of Knowledge can't melt those forms of God. What does he mean by that? He means that bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, he used to say in his own quaint language, they don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. Why force them to become sugar if they want to eat sugar? Let them eat sugar to their heart's content. What does eat sugar mean? It means they want to commune lovingly with the personal God in the form that they love. Vaishnavas want to commune with Krishna. They don't want him to melt. Followers of bhaktas of Sri Ramakrishna, for them the ideal is to dwell in Ramakrishna Loka and worship Sri Ramakrishna. That's the highest ideal for them, right? So even Sri Ramakrishna even had a very, very expansive understanding of the final state of liberation, salvation. Mukti, of course, we know is the goal of Hinduism, right? But many people don't know this. Even people who call themselves Hindu. Mukti itself takes different forms in different traditions. There are all sorts of heavens. Christianity, there's a heaven. Islam has a heaven with all sorts of wonderful things. Vaishnavas have their own heaven with Krishna. It's called Goloka or Vrindavana. Transcendental Vrindavana. This is not the one on earth, but the transcendental Vrindavana. And we, Ramakrishnites, followers of Sri Ramakrishna, same thing. One devotee of Holy Mother, Sharada Devi, once asked her, she says, what's going to happen to us bhaktas who just love Sri Ramakrishna? The idea of nirvana terrifies me. Losing my individuality and not being in touch with Sri Ramakrishna. She says, don't worry, Sri Ramakrishna has created Ramakrishna Loka for you. Ramakrishna Loka means this eternal realm of Ramakrishna for you guys. And it's not a lesser form of salvation. That's the beauty of Sri Ramakrishna. Eating sugar and becoming sugar are on equal footing. It just depends on temperament, preference. What do you want in your heart of hearts? Do you want to become sugar then become sugar. Do you want to eat sugar in the form of Christ or Allah or Krishna or Ramakrishna? Then for you, the highest goal is dwelling in an eternal heaven with your chosen form of the personal God. And it's not that you're going to be forced eventually to become one with Brahman, because that's not what you want. You don't want to become sugar, you want to eat sugar. Does this make sense? Okay, so that's the second tenet. Third tenet. This is another important thing. Some people have misunderstood me when I publish this book. Usually what happens is people are too lazy to read books, and so, but they'll watch a lecture. So I gave a lecture at Cyber Family Center in 2018 based on this book, and they watch that and they start jumping to conclusions without reading a word of what I wrote. And they said, so what Medhananda is saying is that Sri Krishna was not an Advaita. No, that's a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. So that's why I have a whole tenet devoted to clarifying this, what I meant. Of course, Sri Krishna was an Advaita, but there's Advaita and there's Advaita. I gave a lecture a few months ago, also on YouTube, a tale of two Advaitas. But there are many more than two, there are multiple Advaitas. Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta is one kind of Advaita, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Another form of Advaita is Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. That's what Turiyanji means. He says, of course, Sri Ramakrishna was an Advaitin. He taught Advaita. But it's an all-encompassing oneness. Everything is God. The tables and chairs are God. The individual souls are God. The personal God is also one with Brahman. You see, how is that not Advaita? And so he would say, Sri Ramakrishna would say, that even bhaktas have a realization of oneness. Bhaktaro ekakar gyan hoy. Even bhaktas realize oneness. Isn't that Advaita? Isn't that what Advaita really means? It means you see nothing but God everywhere. Yes, but it's an Advaita that excludes nothing. It's an Advaita which accepts everything. Okay? And finally, I don't want to say finally, another very important tenet. This is what arguably Sri Ramakrishna is most famous for. He was the great champion of the harmony of all religions, right? And especially in Bengal, if you go, even people who are not followers of Sri Ramakrishna, if you ask them, what did Sri Ramakrishna teach? They love quoting this 4-word teaching of his, Joto Mot Toto Pat. Very famous for this. As many faiths, so many paths. Right? My favorite version of this teaching, of the harmony of religions, is a bit different. It's also found in the gospel, but it's not Joto Mot Toto Pat. It's the epigraph to my book, actually. Tini Ananto Otho Ananto in Bengali. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. The reason why I like this teaching is because he explains why there are infinite paths to God. Why are there infinite paths to God? Because God himself is infinite. God herself, himself, it doesn't matter what it can be Divine Mother, it can be Christ, whatever. Because God is infinite, naturally, it stands to reason that there are infinite paths to God. So in one succinct teaching, he explains the philosophical basis behind the harmony of all religions. Because God is infinite, there are infinite paths to God. And how does he explain the harmony of religions? On the basis of Vijnana Vedanta. Let me give you 2 examples. One is the famous blind man and the elephant. Many of you know this. It's not original to Sri Ramakrishna. This is an old analogy used in Jainism as well, for instance. There are a bunch of blind men. Each of them are touching different parts of the elephant. And they start quarreling with each other. Because one of the blind men touching the tail is saying, I know what the elephant is, it's furry. And there's another blind man touching the trunk saying, you're an idiot. No, it's dry and scaly. Another guy's touching the toe. No, you're both wrong. It's cold to the touch. And they're all fighting with each other. There's one person who comes along who can see the entire elephant, not blind. He says, oh, stop quarreling. You're all right and you're all wrong. They're all right in a certain sense because he says, you're all right because you're touching different parts of the same giant elephant. But I can see that the elephant is dry in one aspect, furry in another aspect, and all this. So all of you are right, but don't limit the elephant to just the part that you're touching. Likewise, even realized souls, this is a radical teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, even realized souls will sometimes limit God to what they have realized of God. But nobody can realize the whole of God. Another one of his examples, a chameleon. He says, imagine there's a chameleon on a tree. And one person comes up to the chameleon, sees it in a beautiful yellow color, comes back to his friends and says, man, I just saw this beautiful chameleon. Go and check it out, it's yellow. Second friend goes, sees a chameleon, but he sees that it's red. Comes back and says, why are you lying to me? You said it was yellow, but it was a beautiful red chameleon. Next guy goes and to verify, turns out it's blue. And they're fighting with each other. No, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. One guy says, stop your bickering. Who's that person? This guy is a weird dude. He lives under that tree. And he says, I live under this tree 24/7. I know that you're all right and you're all wrong. Because this is a chameleon and it changes colors. So all of you are right, but don't limit the chameleon to just the color that you saw it in, because it has different aspects, different colors. It assumes different colors in the course of the day. So now, who is the person in the blind man and the elephant analogy who can see the whole elephant? Who is the person sitting under the tree who can see the chameleon in different colors? Very good, exactly. The Vijnani, who has realized God in multiple forms and aspects. Because remember what Swami says, the Vijnani sees that, has directly realized that the divine reality, which is personal, is also impersonal. Has form, is also without form. Right? And so it's on the basis of this very special spiritual state of Vijnana, very expansive spiritual realization, that Sri Ramakrishna can teach on the basis of his own direct experiential knowledge that there are infinite paths to the same divine reality. It's very, very important. And finally, the last tenet I want to talk about, there's a lot more I could say, but I want to end on this because I promised that I would bring it down to earth and try to be a little practical as a good segue to tomorrow's talk on the 4 yogas. Sri Ramakrishna once, this is not in the gospel, but you'll find it in the Leela Prasanga, which is Charananji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna. One day, Sri Ramakrishna is talking about Vaishnava spiritual practices. And one of them is compassion, daya. And then suddenly he goes into a very high state of spiritual ecstasy. And then he says, compassion. Who are we to be compassionate toward anybody? Only God can be compassionate. What must we do? What should be our attitude? Shiv Jnana Jiva Shiva. Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, which means serve others in a spirit of worship, seeing Shiva, seeing God in everyone. Now, again, this teaching, I'll say it again, Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. That means the right attitude is not, let me help this person. The moment you say, let me help this person, let me practice compassion for this person, let me be kind today, that's implying a certain relationship of superiority. I am in a position to help others. Who are we to help anyone? We're like worms crawling on the earth. He said in the state of ecstasy. Who are we? God alone can help. We can serve. That's the right attitude as a spiritual aspirant. And that practice, that fundamental practice of serving others in a spirit of worship by seeing God in everyone, is based on that same spiritual realization of Vijnana. Of course, we haven't realized Vijnana yet, but that's the framework that we have to be thinking of. Why? Because it's the Vijnani who sees that every single person sitting here now is nothing but God. Swami Medhanandaji taught the same thing. He called it practical Vedanta. He said, what's more practical than worshiping you right here in front of me? He says, of course you can worship God in temples, but the highest temple is the human body. God in the form of human beings. And by serving them, you worship God, the living God. Narayana. Nara means human being. Narayana means God. God in the form of human beings. It's the highest form of worship. You can only ground this very lofty spiritual teaching and spiritual practice of serving others in a spirit of worship on the basis of this Vijnana Vedanta, this vision of everything, of God everywhere and in everyone. If you see the world's unreal, you pull the rug out from under this practice of seva, of service. What's the point in service if the world's unreal? If I'm in a dream and suddenly I become a lucid dreamer, imagine that before I become a lucid dreamer, in the dream, I'm doing all sorts of Habitat for Humanity and working in soup kitchens and all that. Then suddenly, I realize, oh, wait a minute, this is all a dream. What's the first thing I'll do? I'll drop the soup ladle, right? Why? Because it's all a dream. Let me go have fun in my dream at least. Right? The moment you wake up from the dream, you realize, well, why would I help others? So if I know that the world is unreal, why in the world would I do seva? Why would I serve others? But if everything is real and everyone is nothing but a different manifestation of God, then I should never stop serving others. It's not a temporary practice for inferior spiritual aspirants, as some people would like to think. It's something that we should do at all times, even after realization. That's the greatness of the Vijnani, is that the Vijnani comes back to this earth to serve others. Comes back from the highest state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi to help others to attain the same state. So the Vijnani is a living embodiment of the person who serves others in a spirit of worship by seeing God in everything. Okay, so on that note, I now love to hear from you. And I promise that tomorrow, as I said, the whole talk will be much more kind of drawing out the practical implications of Vijnana Vedanta for spiritual practice. Okay?
Swami,
Yes?
who says Sarvam Kalyanam Brahma? It is Shankaracharya, right?
No, the Upanishads, Chandogya Upanishad.
I see.
And that statement, it's a very famous statement, Sarvam.
Yeah, that's everything is Brahma.
Yes.
So how could that be wrong? How could that be Mithya? Something to say.
Very good. Very good question. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. This is one of the most famous statements from the Upanishads. All this indeed is Brahma. And different commentators have interpreted this Upanishadic mantra in different ways. Shankara, in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, he interprets this statement. And he says, yes, it's true. What the Upanishad says is true. Everything is Brahman. But in this sense, what the Upanishad means is subtract names and forms from this world, and what's left is Brahman. Remember what I was saying at the beginning of my talk? Subtract the chairness from this chair, what's left is Brahman. Subtract the tableness from this table, what's left is Brahman. This original Sanskrit, when he's explaining this mantra, is prapancha pravilapanatham. The Upanishad says everything is Brahman in order to dissolve the universe. That's literally what he's saying. It's not to affirm the reality of everything. It's in order to affirm that everything is ultimately unreal, and the substratum of everything alone is real. The rope is real, but the snake has no reality. Again, rope snake, remember? That's how he explains this. Loves the ropes and snakes. Now, there's one scholar, a philosopher, named Satish Chandra Chatterjee. He wrote a book called Classical Indian Philosophies, their synthesis in the philosophy of Ramakrishna. In the last chapter is this thick 50-page chapter in English, where he discusses this Upanishadic mantra, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. And he says, he first talks about Shankara's interpretation, which is what I just explained. Then he says, Sri Ramakrishna gives us a different way of interpreting this, and a better way of interpreting the same Upanishadic mantra. So he's following what Swami Medhanandaji wanted us. Remember what Swami Medhanandaji wanted? Let's reinterpret the Vedanta scriptures in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. What does Chatterjee say? Chatterjee says, the better way to take this teaching is that, no, take it literally. Everything you see is a different but real, fully real manifestation of Brahman. This glass is a fully real manifestation of Brahman. This table is a fully real as a table. Don't subtract tableness from the table. The table itself is a real manifestation of Brahman. What's the evidence? That same Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, uses two metaphors. You had mentioned it way earlier, I remember. Clay and pots, remember? I think you had said that.
Yeah.
That comes from the same Upanishad. There are two famous analogies. They're multiple, but I'm going to focus on these two. Clay and pots and golden ornaments. Now, what do both these analogies have in common? First of all, we've already compared two analogies. Sri Ramakrishna's analogy of fire and its power to burn. We've got Shankara's analogy of the rope and the snake. Shankara ultimately is going to end up interpreting the clay and the pots and the golden ornaments again with the rope and the snake. But how plausible is it? Is it similar? Or is it different? Think about it. So what the Upanishad says is, this entire world, how does this world of names and forms relate to Brahman? This entire world of names and forms relate to Brahman like clay pots relate to the whole giant pot of clay. This whole world of names and forms, he also, the Upanishad likens to different golden ornaments, golden earrings, golden necklace, golden bracelets, relative to the molten gold in a giant, imagine just molten gold in a giant pot of gold. Now, notice that. Does it make sense to say that the golden earrings, the golden bracelets are illusory manifestations, illusory appearances of the molten gold? Or that the different clay pots and vessels are illusory appearances of that amorphous clay, the formless clay? No, it makes far more sense to say that they're real manifestations, real forms of Brahman, of the clay, of the gold, right? And so, if you interpret these analogies of clay and pots, gold and ornaments. If you interpret the famous teaching, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, everything indeed is Brahman, from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna, you end up with less text torturing, a more plausible interpretation of these wonderful Upanishadic statements in the Gita, statements in the Upanishad. That's just one small example. So thank you for the question, but I can go on. I have a whole lecture called, you can look it up, Much Ado About Clay Pots. So if you want more detail, go to look at that lecture.
Because when you do worship, we say that, that these are really Brahman.
Of course. Every time we eat, in our tradition at least, what do we say? What's the mantra we put before lunch and dinner? What do we say? If you haven't memorized anything in the Gita, you'll have memorized. Oh, by the way, this is very fun. I don't know if Arati Krishnanji has told you this. Arati Krishnanji is a young monk in our order. He's under Hollywood, one of our centers. And when he came for sannyasa in India, he was with me at the university where I was in Bilima for quite a while. And he did his PhD in physics at UCLA. Very smart guy. And so he was going to Delhi to attend a physics conference right after sannyasa. And he's wearing his girwa, and he's a white guy. And he's in this metro, and one Indian guy comes up to him and says, he's a little suspicious, a little skeptical. He goes, "What are you? Are you really a sannyasi?" He says, "Yeah, I'm a sannyasi. I'm a Swami Arupeshan." He says, "Then recite something from the Gita." Pop quiz on the metro. And he's in trouble. Brahmarpanam, Brahmar, saved by our lunch mantra.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it gets you out of tight situations. So anyone who's come to any Vedanta society lunches or dinners will know. You repeat Brahmarpanam, Brahmar. This is a famous mantra from the Gita. What does that mantra say? Brahmarpanam Brahmahavi. It's imagining a traditional Vedic sacrifice, ritualistic sacrifice with a beautiful fire. And there's a ladle where you offer clarified butter. There's a person doing the offering. What does the mantra say? Every single thing is Brahman. The ladle is Brahman, the fire is Brahman, the sacrificer is Brahman, the sacrifice itself is Brahman. Now, again, there are different ways of interpreting. That's the same thing as seven calling them Brahman. But again, the Shankarites will say, yeah, subtract the ladleness from the ladle, what's left is Brahman. Subtract the fireness from the fire, what's left is Brahman. Or is the fire itself Brahman? The ladle itself, Brahman. In the way that Sri Ramakrishna says, the cat itself is Brahman. The koshakushi, the puja vessels are Brahman, the door sill is Brahman. Which is more plausible? Again, you can interpret the Gita using that same Vijnana framework. You see how powerful this Vijnana framework is for reinterpreting Vedanta scriptures and how rich it is for our spiritual lives. Even more importantly, because ultimately we're spiritual aspirants, trying to realize God, trying to attain spiritual fulfillment. And it just liberates you. Because another problem with the traditional schools of Vedanta is that they always play this game of higher and lower. They say that my favorite yoga is the highest. Shankara will say that what? Obviously, some of you, what's the highest yoga? Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. What does Ramanuja say? Exactly wrong, the path of bhakti. Chaitanya school, the Vaishnava school, bhakti. These games have been going on for centuries. Vijnana Vedanta liberates you and says, stop all that. All four of these yogas, the great yogas, the Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, are direct and independent means or paths to the same goal of moksha. And there's no higher and lower. It's a matter of whatever floats your boat. Sri Ramakrishna will give the example of a mother who has, imagine, 5 children. One's a tiny newborn, another one is 2 years old, another one's 5, another one is 12, another's 30. And she's cooking fish for everyone.
Jump
Big
there.
jump.
I think you said that was
Oh
a
yeah,
big
sorry.
jump.
Right, so
Word to 30.
I might get a little too much, yeah. Say it married or something. And so she's making fish, but she doesn't make the same fish preparation for everyone. For the newborn, she knows he's got a weak constitution, so she makes fish soup. For the oldest son or daughter, what does she make? A nice fish fry. She knows he can take it, and so on and so forth. Likewise, God has created different spiritual paths and different religions to suit different temperaments. You see how temperament, when you say temperament, there's no higher and lower there. If I say I prefer tiramisu to apple pie, I'm not saying that tiramisu is objectively better than apple pie. Maybe some people do say that. It's not really rational to say that, right? It's just my preference. It's a subjective preference. You have your taste, I have mine. Likewise, some people might have a leaning toward the path of knowledge. Let them practice it, and through that path they can attain the highest. But never say that because I prefer Jnana Yoga, therefore it's objectively the highest path for everybody. And that's a mistake made by traditional Vedantic acharyas. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna comes and says, stop all that. There's no higher and lower here. It's just a matter of ruchi. He used the word ruchi in Bhagavad. It means taste, preference. That's why I say whatever floats your boat. It's the perfect American idiom to capture this. Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
Now's your chance.
Yeah. Here now. Might be a storm tomorrow.
I hope there isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope there's no storm.
Yeah. So I hope if you come away from this talk with anything, I want you to come away feeling like this isn't just dry speculative stuff, but that there's a practical value to this. And that when you read the gospel, you should read with care and I don't mean like read it like a textbook, but I mean read it deeply and thoughtfully. That's something that I think many of us don't do. We let it waft over us or something, but that's nice too. But there's also careful, close reading, and I think that the gospel warrants that. If Sri Ramakrishna really was God, then at least we should pay attention to what God is saying.
Fair enough.
You know, Thakur in the gospel, one of the things he says that everything is done by Divine Mother. Who are you?
I didn't quite follow.
Everything is done by Divine Mother.
Done by Divine Mother, yeah.
Yeah. So if this is the case, like yesterday you were talking about the will,
Free will,
you know?
yeah.
Actually, we don't have any free will because whatever we are doing,
Yeah.
it is our karma, previous life's karma,
Correct.
etc. And it is apparently, which seems as if we are doing, but this is all
That's right.
the prior, force behind that
Yeah.
is our prabhu karma.
Yeah.
So there is a free will really.
No, that's right. Yeah. We did talk about this yesterday.
Pardon?
His view, he would quote Ram Prasad song, Ami Jantra Tumi Jantri. I am just a mere instrument, and God alone is the doer, the operator. And he would say that in reality we don't have free will, but that's not his whole position. I emphasized this yesterday, so I don't want you to come away just freaking out. So long as we have not realized God, we must believe that we are free and morally responsible for our actions. That's another important part of this teaching. We can't help but feel that we're free. Go ahead and try to live as if God is a doer and that you have no free will. Good luck. Get off this chair and you'll realize, when I got off the chair, I actually felt that I freely got off the chair. I felt that I was voluntarily doing it. I didn't feel like God was pulling me off the chair. So it's all well and good to talk about these things, but you can't really internalize it and truly believe it until you realize God. And then somebody says, but what about people who haven't realized God but who believe that God is a doer? He says, if you really believe that God is a doer, you can't take a false step. You can't possibly take a false step. Why? Because God will of course lead you on the right path because you're one with God. You realize God. And so long as you haven't realized God, you don't really believe in your heart of hearts that God is a doer and that you don't have free will. You don't. You can talk about it. Swami Medhanandaji says the same thing. A lot of people say that they believe in God. I'm a religious believer. Oh, God this, God that, it's God's will. How many people really believe in God? Almost nobody. This is another one of these startling bombs that he throws on people. So in the same way, you go ahead and try to believe that we're not free. You won't succeed until you realize God. And then the final part of his answer is from the standpoint of Vijnana, my favorite Vijnana. Why? Because what does a Vijnana realize? That there's nothing but God. If there's nothing but God, and God himself or herself, usually it's herself. This is another quibble I have with Nikhilanandaji's English translation of the gospel. Throughout the gospel, the pronoun used for God is he, especially in these times. I think it's far more accurate to refer to God as she. Why do I say that? Because his Ishtadevata, his chosen deity was Kali, Divine Mother. Why did he translate as he? I think there's a good reason, because at that time he's addressing Western Christian audience, and they're so used to thinking of God as Father, as he. I think that's why he translated, but it's not as accurate as saying God is she, usually. Unless he's thinking specifically of Shiva or Krishna or Christ. But usually he's thinking of Divine Mother. Yeah, I don't know if what was my thread there? I just lost it. I think hopefully I answered the question.
Free will.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
say it
free
was-
will. Thank you. Coming back to the final part of this answer to the question of is there free will from the standpoint of Ramakrishna. So in one sense, we don't. So long as, but we don't from the ultimate standpoint because God alone is the doer. Okay. But number two, so long as we've not realized God, we have to believe that we are free and morally responsible for our actions. We can't help but believe that we're free. But the third part of the answer is we ourselves are God in different forms. Which means that if we can attain the state of Vijnana, what we realize is that I'm nothing but God in a particular form. And if we can identify with the consciousness of God, then we inherit God's own freedom. God alone is free, because God is a doer. But if we are also different forms of God, then we also are free. We're not free as psychophysical beings, but we're free as different manifestations of God. So if we can align our consciousness with the divine consciousness, then suddenly we also inherit the divine freedom. So actually, in a much deeper sense, ultimately we are free, but we're free as God. And we're never free as psychophysical beings. Yeah, Vincent.
So with the free will, I understand that, but does that also go into if you do believe that you are God, that you have total awareness as well, that you're always aware, that you're, for example, not absent-minded and so forth?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, there was a funny incident in the gospel when Anne is referring to the tides. And Sri Ramakrishna is kind of fascinated momentarily. He says, "Oh, explain this tides thing to me." And Anne was very learned, so he started drawing lines in the sand and how the moon is connected to the tides. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, "Stop! After a couple, you're giving me a headache." And it actually says that he becomes a little absent-minded because he gets bored by the scientific explanation of the tides. And so so it's not that like Gyani, and it's even possible that people who have realized God can even show that they are angry or scolding somebody or losing their temper or something like that. But he says the difference between the realized soul who shows anger and ordinary ignorant people who lose their temper is that the realized soul is not actually ever losing their temper. It's just the superficial appearance of anger. He says it's like a burnt rope. There's nothing behind it. It's not like a real kind of anger. It could be to help others, right? To help eliminate bad karma from the people that are scolding. There's some divine purpose behind even the scoldings and the anger and the apparent show of anger. The absent-mindedness. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
You know, this Totapudi came to Ramakrishna, right? He taught him this Advaita Vedanta.
Correct.
Eventually, he has dysentery.
Yeah.
You know, then he wanted to kill himself in the Ganges.
Yeah.
He could.
No.
But my question is that you are the realized soul.
Yeah.
Why did you want to kill his soul?
He didn't want to kill his soul. He knew that the soul can't be killed.
but why did he go to the Ganges? You have to, that's
This is
a
a deep question. This is a deep question. I can give a kind of a deep answer and a superficial answer. Let me go with the deep. I prefer the deep.
But he didn't die, right? He went to the.
Yeah. So let's finish the story and then I'll go into the deep answer.
What's the story?
The story is this is recorded in.
Clarify.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an incident recorded in the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. He's practicing Advaita under Totapudi, who was already supposed to be a Jivanmukta at that time. He had already attained the highest state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He is liberated while in the physical body. He is a knower of Brahma. Then he meets Sri Ramakrishna. He teaches Sri Ramakrishna classical Advaita Vedanta. Sri Ramakrishna was, a super adhikari, which means, like the best student of all students. And so in 3 days, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he attains Brahma. So Totapudi is completely stunned. And Totapudi, even though he was a wandering monk who would never stay in one place for very long, he stayed for a long time because he's just absolutely stunned by this protege. And then, interestingly, the whole story takes a different turn suddenly. Because the shishya, the disciple, becomes the guru in this incident. Totapudi comes down with a terrible case of dysentery. And as a Jivanmukta, as a realized soul, as a Brahmagyani, he's thinking, well, I know that the body is unreal. And I've already realized Brahman. So let the body go. It's the body that's in pain and suffering all this pain. Good riddance. And he goes, let me jump into the river and kill myself. Because I'm not actually killing myself, I'm just getting into the body and gaining ultimate freedom. Mukti in the real sense. Videha mukti, it's called in traditional Vedanta. It's mukti attained, liberation attained after leaving the physical body. It's good riddance to the physical body. Because I know I'm not the physical body. I am Brahman. That's what he's realized. It's with that attitude that he went to kill himself. What happened? Couldn't kill himself. He kept going deeper, trying to go deeper and deeper into this river, and he found what the heck? It's no deeper than he just keeps going. I can't drown. It's very weird and kind of you have to read it to understand. And then he comes back and he tells Sri Ramakrishna, he's showing this. You need to accept the reality of Shakti, my friend. And he realizes that only when he goes to try to kill himself, and he realizes he can't. He says that Totapuri himself realizes that so long as he's in the body, he is under the jurisdiction of Shakti. He cannot escape. And before that, he would taunt and tease Sri Ramakrishna for worshipping Divine Mother, for praising Divine Mother. He would sometimes clap his hands, taking Mother's name. He said, what are you, making chapatis? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, now you understand my mother. Now, again, come back to Vijnana. Because it seems to me that the tail end of his stay with Totapuri, when he becomes the guru to his own guru, what he's doing is telling Totapuri, look, I'm very grateful to you for giving me jnana. Now I'm going to make you a Vijnana.
It is Brahman and Shakti.
Yeah, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. That's what Totapuri wouldn't accept before he came to Sri Ramakrishna. And it's through this miraculous incident that Sri Ramakrishna made him accept Shakti. And he, out of his grace, he said, since you made me a Jnani, I'm going to make you a Vijnana. That's how I see this. Other questions? Oh, so the deeper philosophical thing I was going to say, it gets a little technical, but in classical Advaita Vedanta, so if you study the original texts, Shankara, and also Shankara's followers, Madhusudan, Saraswati, Chitsuka, and others, Jivan Mukti is a huge problem in Advaita Vedanta. And you might think, why is it a problem? Advaita is famous for accepting Jivan Mukti. What is Jivan Mukti? Attaining liberation while still in the physical body. That's what Jivan Mukti means. And Advaita Vedanta is famous. It's known for fully embracing Jivan Mukti. But when you read the text, you find that it's much more complicated than that. People don't read texts, as I said, now in this Twitter age. Nobody reads books. Read Shankara, read the original classical Advaitins, you'll find that they're in tremendous difficulties when they try to explain how Jivan Mukti is possible from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. Why? What's so complicated and difficult about explaining Jivan Mukti? Does anyone know? Think about it. Why is it so difficult to justify the possibility of attaining liberation while still in the physical body for a follower of Shankara?
Body doesn't exist.
Nothing in this world exists, and the body is part of this world. It's physical. It's made of matter. It's a product of ignorance. Now, if you realize Brahman, it means that you've completely eradicated ignorance. If you've completely eradicated ignorance, there should not be a body and there should be no world. But to explain the Jivan Mukta, what is the Jivan Mukta? Somebody who's liberated while still in an illusory physical body, looking at an illusory world. Now, the difference between the Jivan Mukta and the ordinary ignorant person for an Advaitin is the ignorant person looks at this world as a real world. The Jivan Mukta looks at the same world, but knows that it's a dream. So it's a difference between being in a dream and not knowing you're dreaming, that's the ignorant person, and being in that same dream, but as a lucid dreamer. The Jivan Mukta is like the lucid dreamer. But the problem is that can't be the highest ideal. Lucid dreaming is not the highest ideal for Advaita. What's the highest ideal for? We're using the dream analogy. What's the highest ideal for classical Advaita? It's not lucid dreaming. What is it? Somebody should be able to tell me. Wake up from the dream. That's the goal. It's not, right? So long as you're in the dream, that's not the highest goal. It's better to be a lucid dreamer than not to be lucid, not to know. But the even higher state is get the heck out of the dream. Because it's a dream. And so what classical Advaitins say, Madhusudana Saraswati says it and others, they say that even the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance in them, which accounts for the persistence of the physical body and accounts for the persistence of this illusory appearance of the world. Avidya Lesha is a Sanskrit term, which Advaita, these are not their opponents, who are, they themselves, in order to explain the concept of Jivan Mukti, say that, so it's not quite Mukti, because there's still a trace of ignorance. And then you might ask, well, when does that trace of ignorance go? When you leave the physical body. And then the opponent will come in and say, then in what sense are you accepting Jivan Mukti? That's not full Mukti. The moment you posit a trace of ignorance, that's not full liberation. You get full liberation after leaving the body, therefore you don't accept Jivan Mukti. And so in the same way, now coming back to Totapuri's thinking, in terms of the classical Advaitic ideal, the highest goal is not Jivan Mukti. The highest goal is Videha Mukti. Good riddance to this physical body. So let me drop it, because I already know that I'm not this body. Ramakrishna comes and says, no, but now I'm going to make you a Vijnana. And now you need to go help others out of their spiritual misery and ignorance. Because they're real. Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. I'm God, you're God, others that you're helping are also God. The moment, another example which Shankara uses is you're walking through a desert, like one of the desert that we walked through this morning, for instance. And what happens? Sometimes you might see what seems like a beautiful body of water, and you're thirsty. You start running toward that body of water until you realize what? It's a mirage. Exactly. Right? Now, the moment you realize it's a mirage, what do? Do you still run toward it and try to drink water out of it? No. The moment you see a mirage as a mirage, it makes no sense. People will think you're crazy if you still try to drink water from out of that mirage. In the same way, if you really see this world as unreal, why in the world would you continue to serve people? It makes absolutely no sense. People will call you crazy. So it only makes sense to continue to serve others, to help others, if you believe that they are, each one of us is a living temple of God. This is heady stuff.
There are a lot of, like, for example, Rishi Opstavakra and Maharaj Jonak, they were Jivan.
Who's the second one you said? Ashtavakra was the first one.
Maharaj Jonak.
Janaka. Yeah. He's a Bengali, so he's pronouncing like a
They were there, and they have their Jivan Mukta. How could that be? You know, I mean, they are Advaitam, both of them are Advaitam.
So the Jivan Mukta is in the sense that classical Advaitins define Jivan Mukti. They had a trace of ignorance.
They still have ignorance.
I'm not a critic of Advaita. I'm saying it as, these are Advaitins themselves who are explaining Jivan Mukti by positing this trace of ignorance. Go to the text originally and you'll find it. Neo-Advaitins, the modern Advaitins, they downplay this stuff, and they themselves don't usually read the text. And they say, no, what trace of ignorance? No, Jivan Mukti, the Jivan Mukta is fully liberated. But if you go to the original text, they're much deeper thinkers, actually. And there's a reason why they had to, you know what the reason is now. This whole world and the physical body is a product of ignorance. So if you really have full liberation, you should not be in the physical body. The ideal has to be Videha, leaving the physical body. And so Sri Ramakrishna, now, coming back to the gospel, the word Jivan Mukta comes up in a number of places. How does Sri Ramakrishna define the Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while still in the physical body? Does anyone know? He says that the Jivan Mukta is the one who knows that God alone is the doer.
Say it again.
The Jivan Mukta is the one who knows that God alone is the doer. Tini Korta. The doer, D-O-E-R, capital D.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about.
Like that one we discussed.
Yeah, but notice, he's not defining the Jivan Mukta from the standpoint of classical Advaita Vedanta. He's defining it in terms of bhakti. I'm a mere instrument in the hands of God. That's bhakti. That's devotion. Why? Because he knows that Jivan Mukti is not an ideal, not the highest ideal from the standpoint of classical Advaita Vedanta. So he explains Jivan Mukti from the standpoint of bhakti. The one who is liberated while in the physical body is the one who knows that he is just an instrument of God. That God alone has become everything and is the doer. So that Sri Ramakrishna was very, very intelligent, actually. He understood all these things. That's why another thing that he says in many places. Ordinary souls, when they attain Nirvikapa Samadhi and they remain in that state, they leave the body within 21 days. What is he saying? The highest ideal is leaving the physical body. According to classical Advaita. But the Vijnani comes back from the state of Nirvikapa Samadhi to remain in the physical body. Why?
To serve the others.
Yes. You can't explain that from the standpoint of classical Advaita. What classical Advaitans say is, yes, some come back, but that's a kind of regrettable thing because they have what's called prarabdha karma pulling them back to this world. That's the trace of ignorance. That prarabdha karma, that residual karma, which forces them to come back to the physical body, that doesn't allow them to remain in the state of samadhi, is that trace of ignorance, the avidya-vilesha. When they completely eradicate even their remaining prarabdha karma, that trace of ignorance, what happens? They go into samadhi, leave the body. Then alone can they leave the body within 21 days. Otherwise, what happens is before the 21 days is up, your own prarabdha karma will pull you back to this world. That's the trace of ignorance, which classical Advaitans talk about. Does that make sense? So it's a little technical, but I think it gives some depth and philosophical significance to this whole incident with Totapuri. It's a wonderful incident. You've got to read Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play by Swami Medhanandaji. It's Chetaji's translation. He explains this incident in great detail. Okay, 7:13. This is intense. We've had yeah. So okay. Any last thoughts or questions before we conclude? Thank you so much. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arnamastu.
I wanted to quickly say the coming up stuff. So thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, Swamiji. Amazing talk. This is really kind of the vision we hoped for, having this place for the devotees here, so that we can have this kind of talk and dialogue, and just the feeling in this room is alive. So we want to keep that going on. The things that are coming up, we have Swami Medhanandaji coming the first Wednesday of next month of September, and then we have Swami Sumanathanandaji coming on the 15th, 16th, and 17th that weekend, and we'll be doing the same kind of a schedule, perhaps at the Sunday at the temple. So we'll send out emails for you, and if you're not on our email list, make sure you give me your email address and we'll make sure. We have a new email address. It's lvvedantacenter@gmail.com. So if you're not seeing it, check your spam. You might have to add us to your mailing list. And come on, it's okay. No problem. So, and if you guys want to put some flowers on the altar, feel free. We're gonna cut some more, so there's plenty for everyone. Don't feel like you have to. And if you can do us a favor, don't tear them apart and put them separately, because it's really hard to clean in those little cracks that everything gets to. So please go ahead and take some flowers.
Just started raining. Very bad.
Hi.